So it's time to add persistence across running sessions by saving and loading our journal from files. Let's start by first saving our journal to a file. So we're going to come down here, and anytime that you work with file IO, you always start with this built-in called open. So here we can pass the file name. By default, you see the mode is R, that's read-only text, but we're going to change that to W for write. And we're not really going to worry about the other options. So we need a file name that goes here, and we're going to have the mode to be write because we're going to create or replace a file. We're not going to just read one. And we'll catch this, and I call it FOUT from file output stream. You can call it whatever you like. It's just a variable. The first thing we really have to do to make this work is actually get this file name here. So I could say, let's actually have a little folder that we're going to save our files into, directory. So let's call this journals. Let's suppose we want to put them in there. And I could say something like this. I could say file name equals journals slash, and then there's this name. Remember, we're passing in this journal name here. So let's say name. And let's suppose on the end, we're going to have a JRL file extension to indicate our custom journal format or whatever. It's hardly going to be worthy of that, but here we go. Now, technically, this would work on OS X and Linux. It may not work on Windows, right? Remember, Windows uses backslashes to separate directories, not forward slashes. But more important than that, if I'm combining multiple directories, say if I'm given like a base directory equals something like this, /, and I'm given a relative directory equals data/temp. If I'm given these two and I want to build up the full path, I would say full file equals base directory plus, and I need to use a little separator here because you can see on this part there's no separator up there, and then we'll say plus, right, relative directory, like so. And if this is passed to me, well, do I know whether there's this little slash on the end? Do I need to put it here? Do I check? All of those little nuanced details. In Python, we don't actually need to deal with any of that, and we get OS independent path operations all by using this module called OS. So we're going to come up here, we're going to import OS. And down here, I can say, instead of doing this thing, I would like this file to be os.path. And we can just say join and put a whole bunch of little path segments together. So we can say /journals, comma, the name, like so. Now, it won't really join the extension, right? It'll think that's a separate file. So it's up to us to add the extension. But other than that, it'll take an arbitrary number of segments and put them together here. And let's just print would load from this here. Okay. So when I run this and we exit, you would see would load. I suppose that should be saved too. But here we have our /journals, and we can even go one step farther, make this very explicit. If I'm going to write that to a log file, I need to know what the working folder was at the time, right? So I could say path.absolute_path. Now if I run it, exit out here, you can see user, screencaster source, Python jumpstart, number 4, right? This is the full path, and this works perfectly well on all the major platforms. Okay, so this is going to let us work with that folder right there. And let's go ahead and say just this, saving to here. And put a little indicator that that's not proper app output at the terminal there. All right, so now we have our file name. We can go and open it, and we can go through our journal. Remember, our journal is this list of strings. So we can say for entry in journal data. I can say fount.write, and I can write this out. I'll say entry. Now, if I say it this way, it's not quite going to work the way we hope, but let's go ahead and leave it for a moment. Say fount, last thing we want to close this. You always want to close the file handles as soon as you're done with them. So let's run this, and I'll show you a better way to deal with this close scenario. So if I run this, and let's add an entry, say thing 1, add an entry thing 2, and we exit, you'll see that this was saved. And if we go up here, there's now this file. And if we open it up, these are actually all on one line. Probably not the best. Now, we probably should talk about the format just a bit anyway. We're going to keep this super simple. We're going to get to more interesting file formats later. For our journal, we're just going to write one entry per line. But notice these were all on the same line. So we need to actually add a new line character. So \n. And then when we rerun this, say let's add a few entries here. And exit. Now if we go back to our journal, you'll see perfectly misspelled thing 1 and thing 2. Excellent. Okay, so it looks like our file IO is working. Now, we want to make sure that we call close. If there's some kind of exception or error or early return in this, obviously a very small bit of code, but even it could have an error. However, the more complicated the code gets, the more helpful what I'm about to show you is going to be. If we return without doing this, well, that's kind of a problem, right? So what we want to do is in Python, there's actually this thing called a context manager that will say for this block or suite of code, I would like this object to exist. And regardless of how you leave it, through an exception, early return, falling through the bottom, I want you to clean up. And it's up to the item being used to determine what cleanup means. And you can imagine for files, that's like close and flush the buffer. So the way we do that is a little different than this. We'll say with, it's kind of reversed. We'll say with open file name and same parameters as fout. And then we do a block like so. And we won't need this anymore because as soon as we leave this block right here that's defined by the indented section, it's going to automatically call close. Okay, so let me clean this up a little bit. Here is our final save. We're going to use os.path.absolutePath to get a full path from our relative path we built up with join. And I notice we do have these forward slashes in here, so maybe it would make more sense to write it like so. There we go. That way it doesn't depend on / being a particular separator. So here now we have a proper OS independent style. We use our context manager, our open method to get the file stream. And then we just call write, and we write out the text. If we wanted a binary version, we would say WB for write binary. And that's that. We're going to do something very similar for loading it. In fact, so much so that we're going to use exactly the same line of code. I kind of feel like that should be like a method or something. So let's go over here, and I could write a method in this file, or I could go to PyCharm and hit Control-T and say I'd like to create a method. Let's call it get full path name, something like that. All right, and you see down here it's returning this. We're calling this file name here. Let's just do that same thing up there. So this one is different. There usually will be a file, but not always, right? Not the first time. So we can say something like this. If os.path.exists file name, then we want to load it. Otherwise, we're going to return this thing. Now, we're going to need to initialize that and maybe fill it with data, maybe return the empty version. But let's do this here. So now, just like before, we're going to use our with, but we're going to not use the W. We're not trying to truncate or write it. We're just going to read it. And I'm going to call it fin for file input. And then we can just say for entry in fin.readLines. And that'll just read in the lines. And let me just print would load and put a little print here entry. Now, this is not going to work out quite as good as we would like, but let me run it. So it would load thing 1, new line, thing 2, new line. It turns out that in Python, when you do the read lines, the new line character is still stuck on the end, right? That \n that we put here, or just naturally in the file, is on here. It's not removed. So we can come over here and say strip. Maybe we want to be careful and just say r strip off the end. Now, if I run it, I would say would load thing 1, thing 2. Those are exactly the entries we were hoping for. Okay, so instead of doing this, we'll go down here and we'll say data.append entry. Now, if I could just load it up and I say list, oh yeah, I forgot the r strip. So let's say r strip to remove the white space off the right-hand side. Now have a look. Perfect. Still misspelled. Thing 2, thing 1, exactly the right order because remember, we're reversing it. So let's go and actually add a few more. We'll say add. This is fun with files. And add one more. Today I saved this. If we exit out, you'll see saving to this location. And if we rerun it and just do a list, boom, there are the things we wrote back in our file. You can see Right, there's the chronological order we created, which is, of course, reverse of what we're showing it. Beautiful. Let's go back and just review what we did for load. It was even easier than save, wasn't it? Okay, over here in journal, can remove our to-do. So we create an empty journal bit of data, and then we get the file name using our full path function, right? OS path, absolute path, and join. And then we ask if it does exist, let's load it using our super simple format of 1 entry per line. And then we're going to return either the populated or empty data set. And on the way out the door, we create a writable file and we just write out the format that we were expecting. Perfect.